This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley of Respectonomics. And today with Sarah, we're going to take a look at relationships. The relationships we're going to focus on are corporate or business relationships. And we particularly would like corporations and businesses, organizations to tune into this and to listen very carefully and come back to us for follow-up, maybe meetings, maybe workshops, maybe particular special presentations, because the business of relationships within an organization are crucially important. Sarah, What do you think?
Excellent. Hi, Jeremy.
Good morning again.
Thank you for having me again.
Actually, the public at large says, would they please have more Sarah and less Jeremy?
Oh,
that has been said.
I don't think that's a thing.
Well, we do it very well together.
Anyway, so excellent introduction. So yes, we are looking at the corporate relationship today. And is it floating or is it sinking? And so we're going to explore what relationships mean in the corporate context, the tools you need to initiate them, and most importantly, their objectives. So whether you're building a partnership, you're fostering client loyalty, or cultivating a thriving workplace culture, this episode will equip you with insights to ensure that your corporate relationships stay afloat and thrive. So let's commence, Jeremy.
Yes.
And when you're defining relationship for the corporate world, what is your definition? What does that mean to you?
Well, it's a little more complicated than I thought, because my initial sort of insight, if you will, oversight, was that a relationship in the business world is the manner in which we engage with one another. And that's probably simplistically nothing wrong with that.
Right.
But in fact, the word relationship needs looking at a little more closely. The re part of it, beginning of relationship, the RE, that is emphatically telling us how this is a recurring activity. A relationship is not a static, I've done it, it's okay. It's recurring, it's repetitive, it's rebuilding, it's a continuing process. As a matter of fact, it's organic. So I think The first thing to remember is that whatever we come up with in terms of a relationship, to remember how much it can change and how much we have to work on it. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of investment. Corporations are very big on return on investment. I don't think you'll find a higher return on investment than organizations that engage in good relationships internally. That's number one. Secondly, now this is going to take you down the path of Latin. You know how you love to hear Latin?
I don't think there's an episode where we don't have the Latin infused into it. So
there it is.
Bring it on.
There it is. Relationship, the latio part of it, is actually the passive tense, to be carried. And what that means is, and it's a very important aspect of relationship, we mostly think of, I think, relationships as being, what am I doing for you? Well, that's fair enough. But the most important part of a relationship is allowing you to relate to me. In other words, it's a passive activity in that sense. It's very important that I allow you into my life. It's not good enough to be pushing me on you, which is probably not an attractive idea anyway. But the second part is, or the first part is, I need to open my door so people can come into my life. That's the passive sense of latio. And it does mean to be carried. Relationships are designed to carry one another. In a world where we're kind of loose, being carried is pretty nice.
And why are relationships vital to corporate success?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. I mean, one of them, when I first started on Respectonomics and we talked about restoring the dignity of the human being, that is central to the corporate culture. I mean, you might even say it's obvious. The catch is, and I think where we've all got this a little bit off the mark, is when we talk about relationships internally, what we're really talking about is the way we engage with one another, and that's fine. But when we do this properly, there are a number of significant defining benefits. we find ourselves more productive. We become innovative. We break down silos. If you have a good relationship, the silo disappears. So you get a much better free flow of information and ideas. And I think also on top of that, you get people happier. Now, if you're happy at work, that might sound, oh, that's nice. But it's also what encourages tenure. It's what encourages
Mhm.
duration. It's when people say, yeah, I enjoy going to work and I'm going to stick around with my employer. And you know what else?
Loyalty and engagement
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
productivity.
exactly. It all benefits. The internal relationships are very, very helpful to that. And I think also the other thing is that when you have those relationships where the person enjoys coming to work, have you ever heard when somebody says, my employer looks after me really well? It's
Do
a,
you mean how often have I heard that?
I know how often you have not heard it, and that is my point. It's an easy way to differentiate yourself, number one. And
Hmm.
number two, people love to hear your employer takes good care of you. And whether
Absolutely.
it's the bakery or whether it's an automotive engineering company, it doesn't matter. People who feel they're being looked after and tell people that it's very encouraging. It brings a smile to people's faces.
Absolutely. And that can benefit and impact relationships that are external from corporate world. I
Absolutely.
know we'll get into in another
Yeah.
episode community relationships and personal relationships in that regard.
We're
So
going to do that. And then I think
absolutely.
the next episode is going to be on political relationships. But one of the things that is overlooked, and this is really almost the cornerstone of the relationships in a business organization. And it goes like this. If the organization engages in good relationships with one another, let's just agree we've got that working nicely.
Hmm.
Those are exactly the vectors, they are the expressions, if you will, that then migrate to the customer, they migrate to the shareholder and to the supplier. In
Absolutely.
other words, internal relationships effectively become external.
Hmm.
And the externality of those relationships is incredibly valuable. I mean, we just talked about how I can get people to be more innovative and productive and enjoy themselves. Isn't it amazing that that can turn directly into client customer satisfaction?
Absolutely. It's a
Repeat,
compounding
right?
effect. It's a ripple effect,
It
right?
is. It's a very, and I think it's one of the most important migratory impacts of having good relations internally. And any corporation that's listening to this, if you want to understand your market, understand yourselves first. I mean, the
Hmm.
Greek philosopher, hey, you like Latin? How about some Greek?
We'll
We
take
like
it.
Greek this today?
We are allowed anything you'd like.
Okay, well, the Greek, all right, with limitations, I'll go with that. But the Greek expression is gnoski se, which means know thyself. I
Hmm.
mean, the Oracle at Delphi used to say that. But the point of the matter is, if a corporation knows itself, which happens through good relationships, think how that translates into the client, into the shareholder, into the prospect, and
Absolutely.
into the supplier. Everybody
Internal,
wants to deal with you.
right. Internal, external relationships. Yeah.
It's a brilliant combination, and I trust that corporations are listening very carefully because I'll tell you one other thing. If you get onto Google and look up MBA programs, you will see huge analysis on balance sheet, accreditations, and all these fancy words, and risk analysis and blah blah blah. Do you know there's practically no reference to human behavior?
I do.
I think that's shocking. I mean, every economic activity, I don't care how complex it is, and we've talked about this. You can have the most complex economic transaction. You can have collateralized debt obligations and balance of payments and anything else you like thrown in. You know what? At the beginning of the transaction is a human being,
Right.
and at the end of the transaction is a human being.
People are the
Yeah.
nucleus
Hmm.
of the business,
Yeah,
right? They're the core.
absolutely. And that's what we need to emphasize. And that's
So
what these good relationships are about. Yeah.
absolutely. So what are in your mind, what are some effective tools or platforms to initiate corporate relationships? Like what are some tools that people can think about putting in place?
I think you would agree with me that if you went into, what's the bookstore called? Indigo. If you went into
Yeah.
Indigo, you would find shelves on answers to your question, meaning, the self-help and the
Hmm.
way we analyze ourselves and all that good stuff. Actually, the answer is sitting right in front of every human being, every morning, every evening. I mean, you were joking with me about getting up this morning and feeling a bit tired and all that stuff. But the reason you knew that, aside from how you felt, but the reason you knew that is because you looked in the mirror.
I certainly did.
Okay, there was a giveaway. And I was looking in the mirror too. And that's how I came to use my Chanel aftershave today, because I knew everybody would be interested, aren't they?
Of course.
But seriously, the human being has five senses. I have the ability to see, to hear, to smell, to taste, and to touch.
Hmm.
And engaging those five senses with another human being is the best starting gate we can all have. Take the CEO, and I don't like to label the CEO because I think this actually translates right the way through the organization. So if you're the one that's polishing the doorknobs on a frosty Monday morning, it applies to that individual every bit as much as it to the chair of the board. But the answer is, am I seeing other people?
Mm.
And I think the answer is quite often we don't. We just don't see them. You
And
know
what do
that?
you mean by seeing them?
Well, I think physically is not a bad point.
Hmm.
Meaning, how
The
often do you
obvious. Yeah.
walk along the street and, somebody says, did you see, Sam this morning? And you say, no, I didn't see him or her. So what I'm getting at is just making a determined effort, a deliberate effort, intentional effort to see people.
Hmm.
You have the eyes to see, let them see other people.
Right.
I think a lot of, I'm going to say corporate executives, I don't think they see people.
Mm.
I think their starting gate in the morning is what's in it for me? Well, let's
Mhm.
move away from that starting gate and I'm going to go and see people. It might be physical. It might be walking around the office. It might be going outside and talking to a few customers or whatever, but
So
seeing
engagement.
people. Hmm?
Engagement.
Yeah, but just doing it, everybody has the physicality to do it.
Right.
And if you aren't seeing, are you hearing? What is the one thing that a typical employee or staff person talks about today? Nobody listens to me. I
Right.
remember at a financial institution, they were explaining something that had really basic. And I said, well, have you taken it up the line? And the answer came back, nobody listens. So it
Mm.
strikes me that the five senses are worth just taking one look at. They are so basic and so fundamental, and we're allowing all the complexities of life and all that internet stuff to take it away. I have the eyes to see. I have the ears to hear. I have the ability to touch. That means I keep in touch with people.
Right.
I can do it different ways. I can't see and hear everybody, but I can certainly be in touch. And it might
Hmm.
be a phone call, it might be a text, the different ways I can do it. It can be even talking to other people in their families. There's different ways of being in touch. And then you think in terms of taste, and you think, well, you don't go around tasting employees, but what you
Probably
do.
not a good idea.
No, you get into a lot of trouble. But what you do is, and this is where it really hits the curb, and that is you taste when you share food together. We
Mm.
need to see the senior people, the junior people, the middle people going. I mean, in Japanese culture and in manufacturing, Toyota, for example, there's
Right.
no executive dining room.
There's no segregation.
No. And of
It's
course there
collaborative.
isn't. No. And sharing breaking bread together is one of the most powerful things we can do.
Yes, we've talked about that before.
We've talked about it before, and it's a truth. But here's the other one, and this gets a little almost, you can hear yourself cringing practically, because you get into the business of, one's ability to smell. And the point about that is this. Those meetings you go to and you hear everything that should be said is said and has been said. It's all done properly. And yet what you smell in the air is something that says,
Mhm.
I don't believe anything. This is bull. I don't really want to be here.
I was going to say sincerity.
Hmm. It has a
Genuine.
it has a perfume to it. I mean, poets have written about this for eons. The fact of the matter is that when we are full of energy and life and sincerity and truth, these are actually, we pick up on them neurally. There's probably fancier words than that, but
Right.
it works. So all I'm saying here is, all we have to do is look in the mirror and make sure the five senses are being fully employed in the engagement with our fellow employees.
And those are tools and resources that everybody has in their hand. It's just a matter of, are you aware of what those tools are and how to use them?
Yeah. You've got them.
Yeah.
We don't need fancy books from Harvard MBA or anything. There's one other thing. We've talked about that Respectonomics breaks the human being down into the three parts of body, mind, and soul.
Right.
And when I use my five senses, it's very important that I look at that other human being through those three filters. So in other words, yes, I see your body. Yes, I hear your mind. Yes, I sense your soul. But by doing that, I become all-inclusive. I encompass the human being when I allow the five senses to engage with those three, the tripartite being of the human being. And it's all there. It's right in front of us.
I think it allows for connectivity, right? To feel connected.
Exactly. The connectivity is huge, Sarah. I think that's been one of the biggest missing links, is that people feel disconnected, and disconnected is a bad word, because with that becomes lack of trust, lack of engagement, lack of bringing forward new ideas. It's a nasty.
I think it's very easy and quite common in the workplace today, for people to feel, they can feel the disingenuine context of things.
Yes.
Right.
I agree. And that's why I'm posing that by coming back to our five senses, which are every human attribute, when we come back to the integration of who we are, the body and the mind and the soul, when you do that, you've got a real way of negotiating the relationship. Now, there's one other thing. It's kind of interesting. Go back to the word. Of course, it's interesting.
Of course it is.
Of course. But you look at the word relationship. We talked about the repetitive nature, the recurring nature. We talked about the passive sense of being allowed to have people come into our lives. But there's another part to that word, is ship. And a ship needs navigating. A ship is based on movement. A ship is based on moving goods from one place to another. And a relationship fulfills all of that. It's organic. We've said that already, but it's always moving, and it's always ready to navigate. And if you went to any sailor and said, is it always smooth sailing?
Absolutely not.
Not. And we've all had disasters and tragedies and crises in our lives. It's very important that those relationships are precisely the opportunity to navigate those shoals. And that's at the heart of it. It's a kindness to another human being.
Right.
In brackets, what's wrong with that?
Nothing at all. Compassion and empathy and understanding.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah.
And I think those are segues to allowing or opening up the ability to connect. Right?
Absolutely.
So what do you think the primary objectives should be when forming a corporate relationship?
I think the corporate relationship needs to understand that it's like a rock. I think the word is it permeacity or permeous, meaning it's the same all the way through.
Right.
And I think that consistency is incredibly important. So in other words, what we need is the ability to be within the corporate boardroom what we are down at the branch level or the customer level, or at the, if you're in the business of selling high-end fashion goods, I would like to see those individuals echoing everything that happens at the board table and vice versa. And I think the one word in there that's very important, we keep coming down to the breakdown of words, but if you break down the words, you do come down to corporate, and corporate means the body. And why would we not look at the body in terms of its totality? Now, I want to take this one step further. One of the difficulties is, you remember those charts we used to get? I don't know if you still see them, but the charts that say who's in charge and who reports to whom and all that stuff. I don't know what they used to call those.
Organizational design charts, flow
Yeah,
chart,
yeah,
flow chart.
yeah. I never understood them because they had these arrows that always seemed to go backwards, and I never quite saw. Anyway, but there's one problem with that whole arrangement. It all smells of hierarchy. It's all
I was
got,
just going to say the funnel,
it is,
right?
and
They
it's
usually
got,
are this shape.
it is. It's the sort of the dunce's cap, actually. But what I think bothers me about it is hierarchy in the human body is an extraordinarily dangerous formula. That's when we say one part of the body is more important than another, which is akin to saying my thumb is more important than my toe.
Right,
That is borderline ridiculous. In every part has a different function. So we are functionally different. But I
right.
think we should be very careful to remove hierarchy from the formula, from the paradigm. By all means, say the head of the body is the customer or the shareholder or wherever you want to go with it. In the banking world, you might be interested to know this. In the banking world, in Scotland, the original banking principle was the depositor was the head of the organization.
Mm,
He or she were the most important persons. In American banking, the head of the pile is the shareholder.
right.
And of course, we can all get into these great moral discussions about who's right, who's wrong. It doesn't really matter when you've got good relationships because, of course, one feeds
Right.
to the other. But what does matter is you allow yourselves to agree that, let's say, the depositor or the customer, the shareholder, whoever it is you want, the supplier even, is the head of the organization. And all of us operate functionally in our different
Hmm.
roles to bring
Hmm.
that to a happy conclusion.
Boils down to commonality.
Hmm. I believe it does. And I think the trouble is that so many people in the workforce today, and particularly when they're trying to climb the ladder, it goes under the heading of what's in it for me. And of course,
Well, even the phrase that you just used there, climbing the ladder,
yeah,
you're assuming that
yeah,
different roles have
yeah,
different value to them, so to
yeah,
speak,
that's
in that
exactly right.
hierarchy, right?
Yeah, no. And again, climbing the ladder I mean, it's a common enough expression, but
Hmm.
it's one of these things that has to be put into a proper constraint. There's one last thing I'd like to say about relationships, and that is most of us have been in relationships of one sort or another, some in our families and some other ways and blah, blah, blah. But you know, one thing about a relationship, there's always a risk in it.
Mm,
And that's okay. But business actually operates on the risk principle. If I take a risk, I will make a certain amount of money. If I get the risk wrong, I'll lose the lot.
right.
And relationships are a very good way of measuring risk. And I'll give you a very classic example of this. Back in 2008, the world was, as you know, dominated by these very, very clever people who had incredible mathematical degrees from, I don't know where, Wharton, Harvard, Stanford. And they were working out these incredibly complex formulas of
Mm,
how to manage mortgages and all that stuff. Well, of course, it all turned out to be a pile of tosh,
right.
and it didn't work. And relationships of actually being able to talk to the person who was buying the house, talking to the person who was going to be installing the plumbing, or whatever it is you would be doing, any kind of relationship has a way of mitigating risk and putting it into its proper context. It doesn't say don't take risk. Life is a
Right.
risk every minute of the day by definition.
Absolutely. Every
No,
choice we make is a risk.
that's okay. But the risk quotient becomes far more manageable and far more realistic when, in fact, we have relationships.
Mm. And that is a perfect segue to a question that I had for you in terms of how can businesses measure the success of their relationships?
I think therein lies a visit to the Oracle of Delphi. I'm not
Mm,
sure I have an answer to that. How do
mm,
you measure the quality of a relationship?
right.
If you think of marriage, for example, how many people can qualitatively can manage their or talk about the success of their marriage? And I think one of the things in all marriages, for example, combinations of people, is the ability to be able to say we had some rough spots and we got through them.
Mm-hmm.
Business is full of rough spots, and the ability to
Absolutely.
get through them is probably part of the testimony to the fact that it was a good or is a good relationship. But to
Right.
measure it scientifically, I think is very, very difficult. And in a
Mm-hmm.
way, that question takes us into a place which is where people are looking for terribly specific, articulate answers. And
Mm-hmm.
Respectonomics is no cookbook. It
Right.
doesn't have specific ingredients that will turn into a cake or
Right.
whatever. It's
It could be a measure of from the vantage point of how happy employees are and
exactly.
expressing contentment,
Yeah.
how engaged they are
Mhm.
in the workplace, which can translate to productivity.
Yeah.
It could be in terms of the ability for companies to retain employees. Again, boils down to how happy employees are in their positions, right?
I think so. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah. Right.
But I think
Very hard to measure.
it's hard to measure, but I think it's a very, very fair question. And I think it's
Hmm.
a question that in any relationship is one that we should be able to kick around.
Hmm.
I mean,
Absolutely.
why
So there
not
may not
say
be a definitive answer, but there's certainly different components that can come into
exactly?
play in
Yeah.
terms of being able to assess
Yeah. Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Perfect. What are some warning signs that a corporate relationship is at risk of sinking, and how do you think it can be salvaged?
I think the classic answer to that is the inability of a company to be able to hear the customer. I'll give you one classic example because I think everybody loves to hate Rogers
Mm-hmm.
Cable. And I find it fascinating that their ability to listen to us is appalling. I think we can all agree on that. And isn't it interesting that they're the same company that has this constant strife in the boardroom?
Mm.
I think there's a parallel there that if you can't get your act together corporately, it
Right.
migrates down to the customer level. So one of the signs is when people are not listening. I have a personal example, which I think other people could probably talk to just as easily, with Nissan. And the cruise control wasn't working properly. When I
Okay.
took it to the service department and pointed it out, back came the classic answer: it conforms to the company's protocol.
Mm.
Not the answer I wanted.
Right.
Yeah. So when you hear companies not actually able to hear their customers, I have a feeling that is a sort of what do they call it? A four alarm fire to say
Mm.
that in the boardroom or the executive ranks, in governance generally, the company is out of order.
I was going to say typically external um, ramifications or outcomes represent internal.
I think so. And I mean, the
Right.
internal ones you see, of course, are things like, when you see people leaving the ship, um, you
Right.
know,
Right.
um, I mean, more classically, recently you saw the Minister of Finance leaving. Leaving the ship is a little bit of a signal that things are not awfully good on the deck. I mean,
Right.
that's
Right.
one doesn't
It's
have to be,
funny.
sorry, you go.
I was going, you go. I was going to say, interesting when you talked about the scenario there, that they gave you a certain response. One thing that I think I struggle with, or I feel challenged by, is when you do call a company, and I understand that there has to be some form of kind of, here's a standard response, or here's a guideline of responses to engaging with the customer. If this is issue number one, or if this is the issue, here's kind of a
Mm,
guideline. What I find challenging is, and I've actually called this out, I've actually said on a phone call before, please stop reading your canned response because you're not listening to me in terms
mhm,
of what the actual issue
mm,
is. So you're reading from your paper and you're not actually addressing what the concern
yeah.
is because you're not hearing me, right?
Doesn't that take us back to the five senses?
Mm-hmm. Sure
If,
does.
if you're not listening, no amount of reading a script is going to help.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I had a classic example of that. This we've talked about Rogers. Well, what about Bell? And the Bell story was the time when, in the good old days with copper lines, and we no longer got a dial tone, so we were able to call on another line to tell them that the dial tone had disappeared. All he said to me was, "What is the dial tone?" And the more I screamed, there is no dial tone, the more he said, what is it? I mean, and we've all got those stories and they,
Right.
but I think at the heart of them, it's a breakdown in that understanding within the organization of one another.
Mm-hmm.
I think once you break that down, once you don't have that congruency, that straightforward flow of people to people, where the five senses are including everybody, where
Mm-hmm.
everybody consists of a body and a mind and a soul, when you bring all that together, then I think you've got a far better chance of hearing your customer.
Mm.
And your comment that you call in and get a script, it's not acceptable.
Well, those examples that you just gave, that's putting things into a box, if you will,
Yeah.
and training people to not utilize all of the senses in dealing, whether it's an external relationship
Yeah.
or an internal relationship.
Absolutely.
Like they mirror each other, right?
They do. Yeah. I think they're congruent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think out of all of this, what I'm hoping, and I'd like your comment as well, please, Sarah, but I would like corporations to be listening to this message because there's a great
Absolutely.
deal of distrust. There's a great deal of unhappiness. I think it was a year ago, it doesn't matter, but I saw 4 senior executives had left a major organization, very well paid individuals and so on. And they all left for one reason that if you read between the sort of lines, they did not feel appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
So
There is lots of work out there, and there's certainly lots of tools and resources, and it's a matter of bringing awareness to corporations of what those challenges or what those gaps can be. And certainly Respectonomics is something that can help to fill those gaps and do some healing or some repair work, if you will, in the workplace.
I think,
Definitely some advantages
and I
there for
love your
business.
comment about the healing because there's enough hurt out there that we should be engaged in healing to give people a decent chance to move ahead.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed our conversation on corporate relationships, and I look forward to additional conversations where we're going to talk about, you said, political relationships.
Political relationships, and then the third one is going to be the family or the community relationships we have.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I look forward to it.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, take care.
Bye now.
Bye.